be no share screen for the clock. So debaters, please time yourself. The volunteer will only type the timestamp in the chat. And we are now on the live stream. Good luck to both teams.
Welcome to Octos of Macau Online WSDC 2021. So seeing that both side opposition and proposition are here and the speaker lineups are all in chat, we will now proceed to do a technical check. So can I invite all the speakers on side proposition to introduce themselves in their speaking order and their preferred gender pronouns if they have any, please?
Hi, I'm Miles. I will be doing the proposition 1 and my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Liana Schmieder-Emerson. I'll be delivering the prop 2 and the prop 4, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, and also all of proposition would prefer verbal points of information, please.
Hi, my name is Cameron Kettles. I'm giving the proposition 3, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you, team proposition. Can I now invite the speakers on opposition to do the same, please?
Hi, I'm Maria. I'll be speaking first. Opposition, my preferred pronouns are she or her.
Yep. Hi, my name is Sheheryar. I'll be the second speaker for the opposition. I will also be giving the reply speech. My preferred pronouns are they, them.
I'm Kamil. I'll be going third up. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and POIs in chat for all of us, please.
Yeah, we'll all take POIs in the chat.
Okay, thank you, team opposition. So before we begin, I have 4 reminders. I'll be keeping time for this debate by texting in the Zoom chat at the 1st minute, the 7th minute, the 8th minute, and the 8-minute and 15-second mark. So at the end of every speech, I'll type the total time spoken for the speech as well. Before you speak, please indicate how you would like to receive your POI, as you just did, whether that be verbally, visually, or in the chat. Speakers not speaking in this round, coaches, team managers, and observers, please be reminded to switch off your cameras and mute yourself at all times throughout the debate. If you are a designated speaking member or a member of the judging panel this round, please switch on your camera throughout the debate, and this is so that we know you're on the call and can attend to you if there are any dropouts. So on the motion, this House supports periodic fixed-date constitutional conventions and constitutional democracies, I will now hand the floor over to the chair judge for this round. Please take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Tamara. My pronouns are she or they. On the panel with me I have Jacqueline and Christopher. We're all really excited for a great debate. And congratulations to both teams making it this far. If you have any questions, you can ask now, but if you don't, we can get started. And I welcome the prop 1 to open their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Again, I prefer verbal POIs. The Constitution, the representation of the nation's will, should not be a fossil. It ought to be a living document that evolves as eras come and go. The fact that the founders of the nation can't foresee the new technologies, the new developments, and most importantly, the new threats to people's rights means that democracy is the only prescience that society can attain. On side proposition, we say that ad hoc amendments are not enough. They come too little and too late. The Equal Rights Amendment in the United States, which has popular support, and all it does is affirm equality between men and women, is still not passed by the Congress and by the state conventions on those grounds we propose. A couple things in this speech. First, a few notes on framing, then I'm going to introduce our first 2 constructive arguments. The first being on why we protect rights by having more representative constitution. Second, on why in post-revolutionary states, we get more stability. My partner, Liana, will deliver on third. On framing, a couple of notes. What is our world? 1, we would have the legislative branch composed of delegates holding a constitutional convention at a regular interval, that is in terms like 10 to 15 years, where they're able to rewrite, maintain, or change the Constitution. 2, we think this timeframe is long enough for evolution of ideas and the observation of large-scale societal trends, and that we need to protect these certain rights. 3, in keeping hold with the ad hoc amendments, we require that supermajority, that is like 2/3 or 3/4 of the delegates, must reach a consensus on the new constitution in order for it to be passed. In terms of the counterfactual, we say that's very hard for ad hoc amendments to achieve structural change. And even in terms of simple changes, it's hard to even have simple conversations about at all, condemning societies to stagnation. Is that clarification? Okay, first argument on more representative constitutions. We tell you that there's massive problems in the status quo, and there's reasons why constitutions are always susceptible to having inefficiencies. The first is that it's written by the majority population, usually at the beginning, i.e. the American Constitution has no mention of women at all and said that Black people were three-fourths of the vote. We tell you that societies usually get more progressive over time. That's why you've seen many social movements happening in the last century. The second thing to note here is that they can't foresee every new technology, i.e. when the founders of the American Constitution set gun rights, they did not think that AR-15s and machine guns were able to be legalized, as the only thing they had were muskets and pistols. We think then it's very hard to raise amendments and even have conversations about it for 5 different reasons. The first is that people have very constructionist views. That is, they want to abide by the Constitution. They don't want to go against it. This is why in a lot of judicial rulings around the world, judges don't afford new rights to people and often takes decades to do so because of the fact that they want to abide strictly by the rules of the Constitution. The second thing to note here is that the harms a lot of times of not including certain rights have not occurred or materialized to the fullest extent yet. That's where you need ad hoc amendments. On our side, we're able to predict what happens next. Third, over time, it's far easier to get moderate legislation passed. So that's why people try to go for legislation instead of ad hoc amendments. We think this is really bad because you're still constrained by the limits of the Constitution. Fourth, we tell you that the majority of delegates oftentimes can suspend the vote in order to ensure that the vote on the amendment doesn't happen at all. This is why in a tons of places, the simple majority stops discussion on the bill from happening because they don't want to show the people that they're not discussing it, i.e. the Senate Majority Leader oftentimes stops the bills from being debated at all. Fifth, in the constitutional democracies, people oftentimes idolize the founders. That is, people who are against a certain amendment can say, the founders never said this, so we should not be doing this. And the people who want it passed don't want to offend the majority of people who may feel like they want to abide by the founders and don't want a drastic change. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
If people admire the founding fathers so much, why is it that in a constitutional amendment they will change it? Because the info slide says you can also maintain an existing constitution in a constitutional convention.
Yes, I'm about to get that very quickly. The difference is you set in the Constitution that a constitutional convention takes place every 10 to 15 years. More than that, you put pressure on the people, on the politicians to actually make changes because it's forced to actually happening. The fact that you put in the nation that that constitutional convention every takes place in order to change it means that it's not likely going to happen. Because the founders of the Constitution didn't set a large process to take place, it was only ad hoc amendments, means that people can point at the founders and say that they never set this, so we shouldn't change it that much. We shouldn't make structural changes to the Constitution. We think then this becomes a self-affirming cycle because people aren't allowed to criticize the Constitution because it's off limits. It's seen as off limits, so it never changes. This is again why the ERA in America has never gotten passed, even though it has massive popular support. Why then are constitutional conventions better? The first thing to note here is that you can get specific adaptations to new trends to society. That is, the US Constitution has never protected privacy because you couldn't predict that large technology companies were going to take over your data back in the 1700s, so there still isn't a lot of rulings that are able to protect people's individual privacy. Two, we think it's likely rights are added because people now vote politicians in terms of like the upcoming term when the Constitutional Convention is formed based on what they're going to do in terms of affording their own rights during those constitutional conventions, whether or not going to maintain, whether or not they're going to make changes and write it in. We don't think this is necessarily going to be super partisan change because again, you need a super majority and consensus. It's not going to be a one-party state because on either side of one-party state can take control of all the policies. What does this mean? First, we think you get extremely late policies that protect rights. India just passed a law that decriminalized gay marriage because of the fact that, like, in terms of the amendments and in terms of like voting and new policies, you can never get the change you needed that's structural that protects people's rights. In the US, it took decades, 40 to 50 years since the gay rights movement in order to get gay marriage legalized. Even further, it took a very, very long time to even have direct elections of the senators. The second thing to note here is that a lot of times you may even get non-existent changes. That in terms of the Electoral College, and Haiti still even bans gay marriage, that rights aren't afforded to the people. Second argument then, why harm the future of post-revolutionary states? I want to note here that after ousting like an authoritarian regime, there are two things that these framers of the original constitutions do. One, they make mistakes for the same reasons we listed it in the first argument. The second thing to note here is that oftentimes it trends to be regressive. That is, they want to restrict rights to ensure stability and the formation of the years after a constitution. Constitution. This looks like the Electoral College. This looks like the sedition acts that you see in many democracies of the world after they're much formed in order to stop the criticization of the government in order to ensure stability. In terms of the counterfactual, we think it's much harder and longer to change things on their side of the house. Why? Because politicians are able to say, this constitution is what liberated us. Note that the difference between the two sides of the house is that this is ad hoc, meaning it's based on necessity. Politicians propose it and they don't want to on their side. On our side, it's mandated that every 10 to 15 years, you must have a constitutional convention to discuss the changes. You cannot block the discussion, and this means people are likely to vote in the ballot box based off these changes. I want to note here, no democracy around the world do people consider like amendments to the constitution a voting matter when they vote politicians in. This directly changes on our side of the house in the incentives, meaning in these post-revolutionary states, which are fragile, you see two impacts. The first thing to note here is that you have less evolution of the constitution in the document itself, meaning you have less rights overall, i.e. how the ANC is able to control South Africa, stay in power, and have anti-democratic institutions and large corruption charges. Second, you get more instability because people are likely to protest when you don't get these changes into law and when the politicians aren't representing you. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to be proposing.
Great. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the opposition first speaker to open their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you're on.
I'll take POIs in the chat, please, and I'll start in 3, 2, 1. We agree that democracy should evolve. And this is a debate, note, about the mechanism of how this change comes about. They're the side that would have the entire constitution with the ability to be changed every 10 years. Whereas we prefer a world where you do not suspend the constitution every 10 years, but instead have the ability to change individual parts through constitutional amendments when there is sufficient political will to do so. Note that their case is painfully uncomparative because their problems are 2/3 majorities and not passing the Equal Rights Act, ideas not evolving, and people absolutely loving and giving too much respect to their founding fathers on the policies on the ideas that they've enshrined in the Constitution. Guess what, panel? All of this exists on their side of the house. Their own policy includes a supermajority. The info side itself says that the Constitution can remain the same after this convention. We think they are fundamentally unable to change anything or access any of the benefits that they talk about on their side of the house. Instead, we think what it does create is various harms like power vacuums and being prone to military takeovers, regardless of the change that comes about through the Constitution. I'm going to explain this further in my positive case. But secondly, note that amendments can create an evolution of ideas in this regard, but do that for individual parts of the Constitution itself. Note, like maybe when the founding fathers existed, privacy and was not that much of a concern. We think when you have sufficient political will to change one of these amendments, you can do so on our side of the house as well. I don't understand why their mechanism is so unique and so specific. That being said, 3 lines of argument. Number 1, constitutional conventions make constitutional democracies more prone to capture by anti-democratic and authoritarian actors. Secondly, this puts nascent and developing democracies at the risk of military takeover, and this is in direct contrast to their second line of argument. And my second speaker is going to be talking about why constitutional conventions put nations at a higher risk of government shutdown. Our first argument then, constitutional conventions make constitutional democracies more prone to capture by anti-democratic and authoritarian actors. It's important here that we characterize to you what the purpose and the importance of a constitution is. And this is threefold. Number 1, it enshrines your basic, fundamental, and inalienable rights in your democracy. But secondly, it outlines the state functions from the power of the executive to the judicial, to the legislative, to the military, to the National Guard, all different state institutions. But thirdly, and very, very importantly, it identifies the limits to state power and points out relative action to take in crises. This is incredibly good because it provides an overarching architectural framework for stability for any government that comes into power. We think constitutional conventions in power make it very easy for individuals with far-right views and power to reform these democracies. Because understand, in a large majority of democracies in the world, there has been a rise in far-right populism and authoritarian leaders. Because structurally, with rising rates of inequality and things like that, people have begun to feel disillusioned with left-wing democracy, and specific individuals like Erdogan and Duterte have been able to capitalize off of that alienation to amass support. They come into power on a mandate that promises to reform all state institutions. And these are countries like Israel, the Philippines, Hungary, Brazil, Turkey, all of these nations that are likely to fall prey to these. Allowing a constitutional convention idea every 10 years is incredibly problematic then for 3 reasons. Number one, it creates a vacuum in a period of reform that allows the ability to amass power disproportionately to the executive branch. We've shown to you that these actors have interests that are antithetical to democracy, and more importantly, we think these are straw man politicians that come into power with the goal of reform and feel they are the only actors who can make this change. We think this necessarily requires them to engulf and take over as many state institutions as possible, because their incentives are skewed towards the accumulation of power in the least amount of hands, towards making institutions the most undemocratic. And make no mistake, the point at which you have a constitutional convention, it will take time, it will take effort, and it will create a time period where there is necessarily a suspension of the constitution. We think every time you give these individuals the ability to remake the constitution, there's a vacuum where there is none. And this necessarily allows them to amass as much power as they want. What does this look like? This looks like politicians in power using the rhetoric of a crisis to limit judicial power, to restrict the power of the parliament. This fundamentally undermines democracy and allows the executive branch to amass disproportionate amounts of power. But the second harm then, that even if there isn't a suspension of the constitution, we think these individuals are still likely to take over democracy. Why? Because they often have a cult following around them, wherein Bolsonaro's party follows him blindly. His polity follows him blindly because they believe in the strongman narrative they have been fed. We think these people often come into power from these large majorities that follow them regardless of what they do, because they're disillusioned with other actors. And these people are able to use the support to amass power. This is bad because A, it skews democracy in the favor of one particular actor and hurts the trichotomy of power that democracy was founded on, but secondly, continues to allow institutional capture. And the third reason that this is bad is because this allows individuals to fundamentally alter the inalienable human rights enshrined by constitutions because of the rising trend for the right to take away and delegitimize these rights. For example, we saw that Donald Trump came into power saying that he would limit immigration, but he couldn't because the Constitution fundamentally enshrines protection for asylum seekers. And it allows them to fundamentally, what constitutional conventions allow them to do is fundamentally alter that and strip those rights from individuals. In this case, the Constitution was the last line of defense before this policy was able to be passed. We think the ability for these parties to alter and point to minorities as harmful and use constitutional conventions to enshrine those narratives far increases on their side of the house. 3 reasons then why this doesn't happen with amendments. Number one, amendments, unlike conventions, there is no expectation for change. Where in conventions, you fundamentally expect to change every 10 years. If you were going to continue to enshrine that idea, it probably wouldn't fulfill that narrative. But secondly, amendments are specific to one clause at a time, where if you wanted to change the whole constitution, you would have to sit every single day, 365 days a year, to alter every single part. We think you have limited buy-in for every change that you make, and to change every single part is way too big a scale for you to take on. But thirdly, and this is very important, note that constitutions have legitimacy and are seen as sacred because of their constants. And you need to amass mass political buy-in to succeed in passing and changing every part of the amendment. Conventions make this idea routine. You don't need the support of every majority to pass any policy. For all of these reasons, we think it's far worse off when you allow these authoritarian actors to maintain power on their side. But the second argument then, that this puts nascent and developing democracies at the risk of military takeover. Note that this argument is specific to the developing world and nascent democracies who for a large majority have not been democratic for a long time and have struggled in the process of creating these democracies. For example, with things like colonization, the creation of a democracy was volatile in itself. This looks like Pakistan, this looks like Myanmar, this looks like vast majority of developing countries across the world. We think constitutional conventions are problematic. Why? Because in the overwhelming majority of these places, there isn't one party that stands out, but there are multiple that have to form coalitions and make compromises to one another to get into power in the first place. We think you fundamentally have to make sure that for the constitution to be repassed or recreated, you have to agree together in the form of these conventions. And this won't happen for two reasons. Number one, ideological differences, but number two, it's already tough to form a consensus, and reaching a consensus to reform an entire constitution is just never going to work on that when you need and have such a fragile coalition. We think what this leads to is a deadlock where change becomes incredibly difficult to achieve. And the point at which politicians fail at these conventions, it increases the risk of military takeover. Because when these areas come into power through decolonization, that is to say their creation was so volatile that they already have a narrative of being police states, of being largely influenced by the military. We think individuals already look to the military when their politicians fail. We think the military can now weaponize the rhetoric of your politicians and your democracy is very bad and it's failing, and fulfill their own incentives by coming into power. We think this is incredibly and independently bad because it's unique to countries where democracy is important to be consistent. The point at which there's a military takeover, it is unlikely to revert back. So even if in a constitutional amendment there's a deadlock on a specific part, the other parts remain intact. There is no space for the military to capitalize. For all of these reasons, vote side opposition.
Great. I thank that speaker for that speech and welcome the proposition second speaker to continue that case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And just a reminder, I would prefer to have my points verbally, please. Let's be very clear. If side opposition was so concerned about the ability of legislative bodies to change the Constitution, they would need to support never changing the Constitution ever. Clearly, this was not their advocacy because they happily defended the counterfactual of amendments that we established in first proposition. The true difference between the two sides of the House is the frequency of conventions and the guarantee that they will in fact occur. The assumption of the opposition bench was that in the interim, when you're having the constitutional convention, you nullify every single part of the Constitution, suspend a state of law, and anarchy ensues. Obviously, the model we gave you was very reasonable. We told you a constitution will be guaranteed every 10 years, so the fact that the Republicans in the US don't want to talk about gay rights and don't want to talk about gun control is not a problem. And then there will need to be the same process for amendments, which they happily endorse on their side of the House, to figure out whether things should be changed. The idea on our side of the House is that you need to force governments to react to what's happening in society, or they will not do it. With that being said, 2 points of clash and then a third substantive argument about why, even in our worst case scenario and their best case scenario, which is people really want to take away basic rights, our side of the House is still better. First point of clash is on why you get more rights and more representative democracies, and second point is on the specific scenario of post-revolutionary or nascent democracies. Let's begin with the idea of protecting rights. What was their argument here? Essentially, they say constitutions serve a very important purpose. They enshrine basic rights and they place limits on things like state power. First of all, I think they needed to engage with the mechanisms of our model, which was that there's going to be a supermajority, which means any radical change in a negative direction is unlikely to occur because you are not likely to get a supermajority. Furthermore, I think their argument about a vacuum is also very unreasonable and very uncharitable, because after the Constitutional Convention, you would only be voting on specific sections of the Constitution individually, like they did in every Constitutional Convention prior to this debate. So there's not going to be a suspended state of law. But then they give you a slightly more charitable argument about why there is going to be a vacuum. The fact that they're having a Constitutional Convention means that some kind of Bolsonaro is going to come in and scrap the political system. Note, if we were talking about one-party states, a one-party state is just going to completely go against the Constitution, go against the separations of powers on either side of the House. Clearly, this debate was about places in which the general premises of democracy have been agreed upon, but there is disagreement within democracies about the specific ways to actually actualize things. The examples that we gave to you were very clear. For example, the fact that women weren't written into many constitutions, the LGBTQIA people weren't written into specific constitutions. Most likely, people are still going to agree on either sides of the House that the executive should have a certain amount of power, the judiciary should have a certain amount of power, but there ought to be things that should be added. On their side of the House, they can never amass the sufficient amount of necessary political capital to get an ad hoc amendment because people like the Republican Party or conservative parties elsewhere that don't like LGBTQ rights will always block them. Our point is you need a forum for discussion so you can get public pressure to actually change things. You don't get that on their side of the House. Furthermore, I want to engage in this scenario where they say basic inalienable rights are going to be taken away. And I think that response also dealt with it, but I want to be very clear. In the case where everyone in a particular country agrees that certain basic rights should be taken away, they're going to do that through every other mean possible, or they're going to scrap the Constitution. But we think the more likely scenario is that maybe 51% of the population or half of the population is angry and wants to take away the certain basic rights of a certain population, and therefore the supermajority will not be actualized. So then what is the delta? What is the change on our side of the house? That is that it is more easy to convince people to change in certain positive directions. For example, to add the clause to be able to have things like gay marriage. For example, to add the clause that maybe certain guns that the founding fathers didn't envision should be abolished in the Constitution. These are things that you can get a 51% to go to an 83% or whatever the supermajority is on our side of the house. It's much easier to do that than to convince people that whole populations should not have rights, because if they are convinced, they'll just abolish the population. Furthermore, if their argument at the end of the day was that political will is good and that's how you get amendments, then they would clearly have no problem with our side of the house, because we are just saying guarantee the expression of political will at regular intervals. They can't have that on their side of the house. I'll take your point after this clash point. What was the comparable material we bring to you? Essentially, they just say the political will be insufficient on our side of the house. I don't think that's true, because that was the same mechanism on their side of the house. But let's talk about the specific scenarios they can never address. One is cases when you don't have an harm to cite in order to get an amendment. That was to say, if you have a certain issue with like big tech or Facebook coming in, or like the gun rights thing, probably you're not going to have sufficient political will to call for an amendment. On our side of the house, the fact that you have to hold a regular convention means there has to be the discussion for harms that can't already be cited in like a court of law or in the public sphere. Secondly, we also think there's going to be certain inertia whenever things are held as a point of pride because the founding fathers did it. This is to say, if you normalize the thing that the founding fathers might have been wrong, it is more likely that you're going to get things like more updated rules on gun control and things like that. That is more clear on our side of the house, why there are scenarios where they're never going to get change because they require that you work against all the political impediments for change. Second point of clash after I take the point of information.
Both sides agree that people like Bolsonaro or Trump will want to make constitutional changes. Where is it easier for them to change the entire constitution? When you are giving a constitutional amendment, or when you have a constitutional convention, or a constitutional amendment which only focuses on specific clauses, not the entire constitution?
I understand your point. I responded to this early in my speech when I said you have to vote on individual clauses of the Constitution individually during the convention. If Bolsonaro wants to scrap the whole thing, he's clearly going to do that on either side of the house, and then the basic assumptions of democracy are gone, which means political power would probably be in favor of authoritarianism anyway. Second point of clash on post-revolutionary states. We gave you very clear analysis. It's not always coalition governments that are coming into power. It could be just the second strongest power. But even if they're right about this characterization, they have to enforce a lot of authoritarian measures to gain control, because they have to say this constitution is what liberated you. You shouldn't uprise against us because we're the ones that saved you from the formerly bad state. This is very bad because it means sometimes integrated into the constitution are things like anti-free speech laws or things that censor people, and that is enshrined unless there's sufficient political will to change it, which we say there's not going to be because these are technically the people that saved you from authoritarianism. If they wanted to talk about fragile coalitions and instability, that is just a unique characteristic of nascent democracies. Our point is, after they evolve a bit, how easy is it to change the constitution? Now, third substantive argument that I think engages them in their worst, like in their best case scenario, which is basically about cases when things are very, very authoritarian. We think if a state is trending away from democracy, for example, religious conservatives get massive support and people want to restrict rights, or disaster occurs that makes people more concerned with safety and less concerned with rights, it is much worse on their side of the house. In the opposition world, they're never going to hold 50 ad hoc conventions to change every clause. This is incredibly inefficient and you can never change everything you want to. So they're more likely to declare the Constitution null and void and scrap it altogether, saying that it's a remnant of an ineffective state. This destroys any previously made progress towards democracy without a constitution. Our comparative is that the Constitution is rewritten to be more regressive. Not great, but the framework of democracy inherent to having a constitution itself still remain. This matters because when the regressive trend begins to reverse, a structure still remains and people don't have to turn to revolution to reinstitute democracy. Our point was also that it's easier to get, even if they were able to get a bunch of 50 ad hoc different conventions, we think it's better to have a clearly enshrined change than over time to have the rights of certain groups continually eroded and to have it passed off as palatable. The delta is clear. We guarantee opportunities to change. They do not. Very proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for their speech and welcome the opposition second speaker to continue their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Right. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
I don't think that government bench really understands what this debate is about, because you can really see that in the starting of government bench's second speaker. They say that, well, if opposition is okay, opposition cares so much about the constitution, why are they okay with constitutional amendments? Because this debate is not about whether constitution should evolve or not. We agree that over time constitutions do need changes. No document on earth is sacred enough to the point that it should remain as it is. That's not our burden. Our burden is we propose individual changes over time to constitutions when there is sufficient political buy-in. We do not, however, support you literally saying that after 15 years, this entire constitution is now up for speculation. This constitution now could remain, could change, and could fundamentally vary. That is our fundamental problem in this debate. Notice why this is important, because all their argumentation about forms of discussion and discussing constitutional changes also apply to constitutional amendments. But the second and more crucial problem I noticed with their case is in response to my point of information. In response to my point of information, their second speaker says, wait, even in constitutional conventions, there are specific clauses you often have to adjudicate and discuss upon. I'm very confused then. Then a constitutional convention is basically a lot of constitutional amendments then, right? Because if you're fundamentally doing exact same thing we're doing, except you're doing it in 15 years, I honestly don't know what the delta is, because that's something they so much so care about. So at the end of this debate, I honestly don't know what government bench is pushing for. They had one claim in this debate, which was over time, constitutions must reform and evolve, and that is a good. I have 5 responses. The first response is, we agree. We agree that it should evolve, but this is about the mechanism that you adopt. The fundamental problem with their mechanism is that they necessarily make sure that the constitution is up for speculation. This is a problem because Maria outlined in her speech that the constitution serves 3 core purposes. 1, the definition of inalienable and fundamental rights. Number 2, the aims, purposes, and jurisdiction of various state organs. And thirdly, how states need to react in times of crises. Notice why this is important, because the point at which you have a constitutional convention, when the 10th year comes about, when the 15th year comes about, and you're trying to adjudicate whether you need a new constitution or not, there is no constitution. Our argument was never that there's going to be rule of lawlessness. Our argument was you will not have that necessary back architectural framework you need for the state. This is a problem because it disproportionately gives way too much power to the executive in that specific time period. That was our problem. The second response I have to this, why do you need constitutional conventions? You already have constitutional amendments in the status quo. Because think about it. All their illustrations, the Equal Pay Act does not take into consideration women, or for example, privacy laws are not taken into consideration. These are problems with specific clauses, not entire constitutions. Why are you willing as proposition to go 15 years, suspend the constitution, remake it, or make it sure it's the same one? Why are you doing this? You can necessarily use the same political buy-in you want and use it for specific clauses. So we not fundamentally think that there is no need for this. But the third response I have to this, all of their problems are very, very symmetrical. Think about it. The first proposition outlined was there's a 75% majority. They have a super majority on their side of the house as well. The second problem they outlined was there is a cult of admiration for their founding fathers. That will happen on their side of the house as well. Because notice, there is a fundamental problem solution gap on their side. The reason constitutional changes do not happen has nothing to do with the mechanism, but rather with politicians and legislators that will exist on either side of the house. The reason Congress does not alter the Equal Pay Act is not because they don't have a mechanism. They do have a mechanism. The problem is those are the people that are unwilling to change it. Those people will exist on government bench as well. How do they bring this change? I do not know. But the fourth response I have to this is they're actually making it harder to bring social change. Because one of the easiest ways for social movements to actually push for change is when they fundamentally prioritize and focus on specific clauses. That is, if you're part of the LGBTQ movement, you can focus on specific clauses of the Constitution and anchor change towards them, channel all your resources towards them. In a world where you have a constitutional convention, the entire Constitution is up for grabs and up to change, which means it's significantly harder to channel that change to specific clauses, because at the end of the day, it is the clauses that are the problem. This means it's harder to bring change on their side. But the fifth and final response I have to this is that they make change more regressive on their side of the house. Why? The first reason for that is that I think it's very important to empirically ground this debate in the real world, because government bench has this sort of assumption running in their case that across all constitutional democracies in the world, everyone is very, very progressive and everyone wants to push for good change. I would challenge this, because in the overwhelming majority of cases, as Maria put to you, most democracies are not like the United States of America. They're like Pakistan, they're like Brazil, they're like Hungary, all of whom are led by far-right, authoritarian and populist leaders. This is really important, panel, because in order for them to push for any of their benefits, they need to prove to you why in the overwhelming majority of cases, politicians want progressive change. Because if you're an authoritarian leader, if you're a far-right populist, all of the change that you want is antithetical to the progressive nature of government bench. Why is this important? Their argumentation then maybe applies to the United States, and that too is up for speculation, but our case generally talks about democracies across the world. The second and very important reason is that our argument was never that there's going to be anarchy and no rule of law. Our argument was, every time you have to draft a constitution, every time you have to rebuild a constitution, in that time period, there is no constitution because you're trying to make one. That was fairly intuitive. This is really important because in that time period, when you do not have a constitution, or even if you have a constitution, but you have very important deadlocks in nascent democracies, because most democracies are made up of coalitions, it is at that point in time, we think authoritarian leaders can fundamentally use their power. And what was the response we got from second proposition? Their response was, oh, opposition is talking about the very extreme case about one-party states. No, we're not. We're talking about Brazil. Brazil is not a one-party state. We're talking about Pakistan. We're talking about Hungary. We're talking about countries that are democracies. Just because they are sham democracies does not mean the government bench can shy away from their burden. It is in the interest of people like Bolsonaro to fundamentally overstep the judiciary, overstep the legislature, and give them more power. This makes it easier and far less accountability for these individuals. They don't engage with that. Notice why this does not happen in constitutional amendments, because only one clause is discussed at a time. You don't have the entire constitution being talked about. This means deadlocks, even if they happen, only affect one clause, not the entire constitution. This means likelihood of military takeover and power vacuums is also far lesser. Before I move on to my own line of argument, I will take that point of information.
The reasonable interpretation of what I told you in the second speech was that during the constitutional convention, clearly there is still a constitution. After the convention concludes, that's when you get the new one. Please engage.
Number one, I told you that when you're making a constitution, the other constitution does not hold value. But even if you don't buy that, you are making a new constitution. If you agree that people like Bolsonaro, like Tayyip Erdogan, fundamentally have reasons to clamp down on democracy and accumulate power, it doesn't matter whether you had an old constitution, the new one will serve their ends. That is what is important. My line of argument. We think in overwhelming majority of cases across the world, most democracies are made up of smaller coalitions like that seen in Israel. Why is this important? Look, panel, we've already seen in status quo that it's difficult for governments to come to consensus when it comes to budgets and stimulus packages. In the United States of America, if they can't agree on a budget, they go and shut down for 3 months. In those 3 months, the government cannot pass bills, the government shutdowns, and people on the ground suffer. We think this is likely to happen in government benches world in constitutional conventions when you cannot agree on a consensus on a constitution. People on the ground suffer. At the end of this debate, opposition agrees. Constitutions should not be fossils, but they also should never become the weapons of the most horrible and authoritarian leaders I am so proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker for that speech and welcome the proposition third speaker to continue their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
And just a reminder, I prefer verbal POIs. Panel, if both forms of change are symmetrical, the question was incredibly clear. Which form is more likely to take place? We concede that I think in the vast majority of cases, the harm is probably symmetrical because you need supermajorities in both. The question then was, I think, most likely about democracies that were fairly stable, wanted change, and were unable to achieve it in their side of the house. Notably, we gave you 3 mechanisms why they cannot achieve a amendment on their side of the house, and only we can. First, people do not want their vote to look bad, i.e. this is Republicans being like, we will never allow votes to come to the floor because we do not want to reveal to people the way we're going to vote. 2, people do not question constitutions in states where the Constitution is held as the most important. So even if the rest of society is thinking the same way that a change should be made, no politician is willing to go out on a limb and suggest the change in the first place. And third, none of these changes can be preemptive because they're a response to a problem on their side of the house, whereas we say we predict the problem before it occurs. All this is to say, on their best case scenario, we think you get less of the changes they want to occur in the first place, meaning problems have to be so massive that the society is effectively undisputed on them for ever change to exist. We say you solve the problem before it exists. You ultimately solve the problems even that people know exist. Very proud to propose. In this speech, I'm just going to be engaging in the 3 scenarios that I think this debate engages with. First, in strong and stable democracies. Second, in democracies that are backsliding. And third, on ones that are trending more democratic than the status quo. But before I engage there, I'm going to first respond to their third substantive, which is effectively what happens in the interim while the Constitutional Convention is taking place. I think the way this takes place is pretty simple, right? People propose bills, propose changes, review the Constitution in full and decide on changes. The distinction they give, I think, is effectively if people cannot agree. Well, we would say that's not only why if they do not agree, i.e. if it's less than a supermajority, then the change isn't made. I feel like that's pretty simple, and it doesn't have to take a year plus in order for this change to occur. But notably, also the rest of the democratic system, i.e. all the civil society, every other kind of law is still in place during that time. I think we can assume the democratic stability is fairly present. With that, three scenarios. First is the strong and stable democracy. Note, I think the greatest clarity between the 2 sides of the house exists here. Why? It's because if there is an overwhelming trend away from democracy or farther into it, then likely the benefit or harm is symmetrical on both sides of the house. But we said the political barriers within democracies right now are likely to overwhelm their side of the house because it simply never occurs. Yes, this is a mechanism debate. We say the greatest reason why you prefer our mechanism is because it's likely to occur in the first place. The reason this matters, though, I think is largely a question of interpretation. For example, if you do not have clarity within laws, and notably, this is the entire Constitution, not just specific amendments, then you have the problem of flip-flops within judicial decisions of, am I in the correct interpretation of what the founders intended? All this is to say, clarity throughout all issues is something that cannot be addressed by amendments, but is incredibly important for judicial review. Why does this matter? Is because when you have inconsistencies, that's when people's rights are constantly revoked because judges can do things like have different interpretations of a constitution that was written decades ago. Only on our side do we get very, very consistent legal practice because you have constitutions that are far more consistent. You have laws of stability, i.e. people can guarantee their rights more accurately on our side of the house. Lastly, though, there are fundamental problems that are evasive throughout the entire Constitution, not just specific amendments. We say a problem like literally not mentioning the word women once in the entire Constitution is not just a problem you can address by saying we would add an amendment that says women are equal. Notably, that amendment actually exists and doesn't get a lot of political support right now because people are too afraid to make their platforms about that. Whereas on our side of the house, I think that's far more likely to happen because people recognize when they're voting people into office, they're talking about what amendments are pretty likely to get support. The reason this matters is because we think rights fluctuations will exist even in areas where there's popular support for these things to happen, i.e. you have to push politicians to do what people want to do only on our side of the house. Second scenario is when there's a backsliding away from their democracy. Note, I think this is where the vast majority of their case lies. We had 2 major impacts from this. First, if a person like Bolsonaro is like, I am fed up with the democratic government, it is not going to allow me to be as authoritarian as I want to do, on their side of the house, they have two options. Either they make amendment after amendment after amendment, and then are able to ultimately change the Constitution that way, or they have a constitutional convention where they say, we're going to modify the amendment, the Constitution to work in our favor. We say this is not great, but favorable to the alternative, considering they're really unlikely just to be like, okay, we're going to do amendment after amendment. Rather, they're probably likely to scrap the entire Constitution and be the sole actors of power. The reason this wins us the debate is for all the reasons they said a constitution is the fundamental backbone of society, meaning the biggest priority in this debate is to make sure a democracy still has a constitution in the first place. Considering the goal is pretty authoritarian in the first place, we would rather a more regressive constitution than no constitution at all, because only with a constitution, even if it's regressive, do we keep the power out of the hands of singular individuals that want to create chaos. Before I move on, I'll take your point. Okay, second impact here. In the world in which they give you, and I think this is their best case scenario, where democracy is truly a sham, and they say that like the Constitution is the only way to check back, I would say this is also a bad scenario. Why? Because there's a fundamental disconnect between what the Constitution says and people believe. Notably, another direct impact, like independent route to the ballot on our side of the house, is in their worst case scenario, we would say it's better than what people believe and what the state accepts, and the Constitution is better for that to line up in a way that's more aggressive than not, to have a complete disconnect. Why is this true? Partly because the Constitution is a fundamental source of legitimacy within these states, i.e. you must maintain that first. And notably, you have to have people buying into the fact that it's relevant to their lives. Even if that is people who are like, I'm willing to sacrifice some of my rights because I feel like my life is in danger, that is still probably better. The Constitution lines up with them, so they still buy into the aspect of democracy in the first place, which notably, I think is the most important impact of the entire debate. Third scenario is a trend toward democracy, and notably, I think this happens most notably in newer democracies, partly because the process of democratization is not a perfect democracy in the first place. Second, because there's often democratic requirements to participate in global trade. And third, there's a greater access to information about rights other people have, unless you want those rights for yourselves. In this scenario, they never engage. We say it is important for these constitutions to evolve over time in a way that forces the governments to involve with them, because on their side, because these states are really unlikely to call for amendments themselves, considering they're put into power. We say you force them to have those votes to add new rights the Constitution could not provide in the first place, because notably states that are newer to democracy can't do things like guarantee the most free and competitive elections, can't do things like guarantee a civil society that say protects your right to protest. All this is to say, you may either make a really unrealistic constitution in the first place, or you make a constitution that's realistic and evolves over time. We say you allow people to first buy into the Constitution, most consistency in our side of the house, and the rights are actually protected. That's a world we think we should always strive to. Very proud to stand in the proposition.
Great. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the opposition third speaker to continue their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Hey everyone, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. Just one second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The most foundational principle of democracy is the idea that people in power can suck And it's for that very reason that we have branches of power. It's for that very reason that we have mechanisms of accountability for people in power. It's for that very reason that human rights aren't dictated by politicians in power, but they're dictated by certain principles. And all of these principles stem from a very cool document. It's called the Constitution. The problem is that it becomes incredibly problematic when you allow the same people that you're trying to hold accountable be the ones who can drive the change of driving up and speculating the entire Constitution from top to bottom. And they do not engage with this refutation. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any change in constitutions. We tell you that most often than not, there are specific parts in constitutions that can be problematic. And if society truly has evolved to the point where they don't agree with those specific points, they will amend that. But for you to allow a politician to speculate and change the constitution from top to bottom simply on the idea that some values can evolve is not a mechanism that we believe is by any means in line with the foundational principles of democracy. But before I move on to like the issues, let me just call out what their mechanism is that their third speaker doesn't deal with. Their mechanism is that you're going to have a 2/3 supermajority. Their mechanism is that within these constitutional clauses, you're going to vote on individual clauses. But doesn't that sound like amendments, but just regular meetings for amendments? Because amendments also have 2/3 majorities. Amendments also vote on very specific clauses. They fail to differentiate their own policy with what we're doing in the status quo, and they're creating these new added impacts of evolution. We tell you it's not okay for you to put the entire constitution up for grabs. That being said, I'm going to talk about two issues. Number one, the idea of instability, uncertainty, and damage in the name of evolution. And the second idea is the idea of nascent democracies. The first idea then. The comparative within this issue is very, very simple. They have the idea of evolution that we told you can be done with amendments, that can be done with any other laws, and that can be happen within the status quo. The only added mechanism that they have is added expectations from the people, versus our argumentations of instabilities and democratic takeover, which is exclusive to you putting entire constitutional documents up to debate every 15 years. But let's deal with the ideas that they have, right? They have the idea that you're going to evolve, that society evolves, and it's okay for these constitutional documents, which aren't fossils, to evolve as well. The first question that I ask over here, do they even bring change? Because we told you this is the exactly same mechanism as amendments, 2/3 majorities, and voting on individual clauses. They're not really bringing change. Their third speaker didn't evolve. But the only mechanism that they have is that amendments aren't likely to happen. The first thing that we told you is that if society truly has evolved, it is in the incentives of politicians to capitalize on that evolution and get themselves elected by saying that we're going to introduce this amendment. But secondly, weigh this up. What's more important? You not getting an amendment versus take over by bad parties, which can enforce themselves into power and allow changing any democratic principles that the country is founded for. Because the major question is, what does debating the entire constitution allow you to do for? We agree that certain parts of the constitution can be problematic and you need to evolve with that with society. But the vast majority and the 75% of the constitution isn't about those problematic parts. It's about things as human rights. It's things about holding people in power accountable. It's things about how you ensure that power is divided within different branches. That is not something, and we tell you it is harmful for those values to evolve, because for the same people who are trying to hold accountable to come up and say, oh, we need to evolve with these values, that's kind of problematic because they're entrenching themselves into power. But the last thing that we tell you is that the comparative is much, much better. If society truly has evolved, then really good politicians are going to capitalize on this and they are going to introduce amendments. Their shaky principle and their shaky added mechanization, oh, there's going to be some added expectations, isn't enough to convince us. Now, weigh all of this up. Oh, by the way, they had some added arguments as well. They said the idea that judges are going to interpret these laws in a certain way. This is something their third speaker said. Number one, that's not a problem with evolution of values. That's a problem with vagueness of constitutions, which is a problem that arises when you're drafting constitutions, something that you are going to be doing in your model as well. But secondly, there are already mechanisms to ensure uniform interpretation when the interpretation of the uppermost judges, the Supreme Court, is something that other courts have to follow suit for. Those are really a bad evolution of their case. But the second idea is something that's maybe much more convincing, is the idea that they don't have legitimacy when they're amendments. Number one, we tell you that this is symmetrical. If people truly don't have that much belief in constitutions, they won't have in your model as well. But secondly, your constitutions have less legitimacy on your side, because the entire constitution is up for grabs every 10 to 15 years based on who's on power. We tell you that's when it has much, much less legitimacy. Now, weigh all of this bad argumentation of evolution with our unique argumentation of you taking over the central mechanisms and foundations of democracy. We told you that the vast majority of democracies aren't perfect with competition of parties. They are moving towards populist systems where their ideologies are based on transforming the country from top to bottom. These politicians come with mass majorities into power because they're able to get a variety of votes with people which have little in common by uniting them against very common differences. And these are super majorities that the people do come up with. The idea of his and the comparative, where is it likely for a populist politician to be able to take over power when the constitution is inevitably under their own characterization up to change and up to the under the expectations of people to change to bring about any form of change, versus an idea where you have to vote or change every single clause of the constitution in order for you to bring or entrench any form of power. This wasn't hung on the idea of suspension, but even then we tell you that if their idea truly is that constitutions need to evolve with the time, then that is exactly something that undermines the legitimacy of old constitutions when you're going for another one, making it very easy for them to entrench power within the first place. I think it's very, very clear who's winning this issue at first. Evolution can happen through a number of ways. It happens anyways because politicians have an incentive to capitalize on evolving values of society. But the idea of populist parties, which are in the majority circumstance, in the vast majority of democracies, is something that is exclusive to you putting the entire constitutional document up to debate. Before I move on to the second issue, I'll take that POI.
So even if your best ground, given that constitutional conventions are now mandated every 10 years and the vast majority of people expect it, could this authoritarian populist change not be reversed, whereas you had hoped for amendments to be passed ad hoc?
But we don't think you should be relying on the idea that there's maybe going to be a good party 10 years later that might be able to change the idea that these authoritarian countries are bringing about. Because authoritarian leaders function on the premise that we're going to entrench power for as long as possible and make sure that no other party is going to bring about that change and ensure that no other party can compete with us. But also there's something that is in direct clash with my second idea, within the idea of nascent democracies. I think the clash within this issue is very simplistic as well. Their conception of nascent democracies is the idea that under dictatorships, you have bad constitutions, and when you transition to democracies, it's hard for you to go back to good constitutions. Now, the thing is, while we agree that these nascent democracies have coalition governments, we tell you that they will change the constitution if it is undemocratic, because it is in the incentives of every single party to ensure that the constitution is democratic. What a more charitable and more reasonable characterization of this is that democratic parties have ideological differences beyond the idea of democracy. Insofar as that they agree that the greatest threat to these democracies is the idea that democracy is going to collapse and the idea that any military government can take over. And also the idea of there's a global trend to democracy was a very bad assertion, because number one, we tell you that false. And number two, we tell you that global trade isn't contingent on democracy. You already trade with countries like Saudi Arabia and the vast majority of African countries. So that was a bad mechanization to bring a third prop. But insofar we agree that this is the greatest threat that these countries face, as long as politicians are disagreeing on these ideological differences on something as important as the constitution, because they are in coalition governments. At that point in time, we tell you that it's incredibly easy for military governments who capitalize on the idea that politicians aren't doing anything or aren't changing the country to take over and implement this policy. This is a very important argument of this debate, and by third prop, they did not refute it. With all those reasons, vote up.
Great. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the opposition reply speaker to conclude their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Notice two broad strategic problems in government bench's case. The first one, and they love saying this, what is their delta? Because they keep coming up and saying that you don't have constitutional amendments because you need 75% of people to vote, that you don't have constitutional changes because Mitch McConnell loves Thomas Jefferson, etc. If these are true, and if these are so endemic, how will they change on your side of the house? The only mechanism they try giving is expectation. But the problem is they shoot themselves in the foot, because if all these structural problems still exist, the fear of expectations will not necessarily reduce it. That fundamentally then means is that if all the problems they outline, how will they necessarily bring their progressive change or evolution? Also, note that in their second speech, they conceded that constitutional conventions fundamentally take into account specific clauses. This means that their world is basically also a world where constitutional amendments are done, just at a more massive scale. If that is true, I honestly do not know, panel, how they are bringing the evolution they so desperately wanted. But the second and more crucial strategic problem in their case is that all of their case is hung on the assumption that the constitution will evolve. Look at the info slide. The info slide says the constitution can remain the same, which necessarily means if all the structural incentives they gave of people admiring their forefathers exist, why will the constitution necessarily change? Why is it likely to necessarily change? So I think based on that level, I think government bench necessarily just loses debate. There are two necessary clashes to adjudicate in this debate. The first one is, where do you have better evolution in democracy and where is democracy preserved? The first thing that we told you under this clash is, why do you need this policy? Because we told you, look at all the problems they point out. The Equal Pay Act does not take into account women. Or for example, there are specific problems in clauses like big tech or monopolies. If your problem is with specific clauses, why do you necessarily need a constitutional convention? You can necessarily channel that political capital to that specific constitutional amendment. No response. The second thing we told you is that we actually bring about better change, because if both sides agree that agreeing on ideological differences is very, very difficult, the question you need to ask yourself is, where are differences less likely and more reconcilable? A world where the entire constitution is up for speculation, or a world with only one clause? And Kamil told you, if politicians want to come into power and the change is necessarily so massive, they will amend the constitution. That fundamentally means that all their benefits necessarily are not exclusive. But the third thing that we told you under this clash was, this is a bad thing, because I don't think they understand how drafting constitutions work. The point at which you're building a constitution, you only have a bare minimum idea of what political structures need to look like. This is a problem, because the point at which you're deciding a constitution, there is no basic framework. This is important because it disproportionately gives way too much power to the executive. No response. The final thing we told you, this was Maya's argument, which was really important. They necessarily put democracy up for grabs. The only response panel they gave to this was, well, Bolsonaro wants power anyways. Yeah, and that's the problem. The constitution fundamentally provides him friction, but a world where you necessarily have a constitutional convention, it's much easier to change it. Contrast this with constitutional amendments. Bolsonaro cannot reasonably, feasibly speaking, change the entire constitution with the constitutional amendment, because it will necessarily require him to come to parliament for 365 days a week. That is impossible. The second and very important clash in this debate was power vacuums and nascent democracies. We told you two things. One, there is likely that smaller coalitions will not agree on democracies. They can't agree on budgets. Government bench expects them to agree on ideological differences. It is at that point in time, we think the military is likely to step over because of the police state narrative, because these are ex-colonial states. It is at that point that they are likely and more susceptible to military takeover. And notice this is important, because the point at which you have this happen, you can never go back to a democracy. Finally, all their case rests upon the assumption that they want to bring progressive change. I'm sorry, but the problem is the overwhelming majority of the world is far right and populist. You can't just assert that. For the simple reason that we engage, we evolve, and we deconstruct their case, I'm so proud to oppose.
Great. I think that's speaker for their speech, and we'll need proper reply to include their case. You can start whenever you're ready.
Opposition 3 wanted to mock our case by saying, oh, their best case scenario is just regular meeting for amendments. Yes, that's what our case was, because Cam and I gave you collectively 5 structural reasons as to why on their side of the house, there are like barriers to introducing ad hoc amendments in the first place. Our point was that if you do not force legislators to come to the table and make amendments, there will never be A, the political will, or B, the willingness of politicians themselves to get those amendments passed. But look, I think their best path to the ballot probably relies on the assumption that in cases like Brazil or Hungary, this is going to be really bad. Firstly, I'm going to dismantle it and say why those scenarios actually go to our side of the house. And then I'm going to be dealing with the best case scenario for us, which I think is more likely, which is on the more stable democracies where you get real change. Let's decimate their path to the ballot. They say this is really bad in authoritarian trending democracies because the Constitution provides friction for Bolsonaro. First of all, they just assert that it's harder for him to ram through amendments. This is not true. This is what he's doing in the status quo. You can take a bunch of amendments and say, well, the like interpretation of the Constitution is disputed, and therefore I'm just going to get rid of that amendment, and then that one, then whoops, there I did a third, and then over time he's accomplished exactly what he wanted to with a constitutional change. That means in the like most reasonable scenario, the harm of Bolsonaro type scenarios is not for their side. But what did we tell you we thought was more likely? It's much easier, rather than passing 100 consecutive amendments, to do things like change the Constitution. And then in that scenario, they're doing the worst harm of our side of the house. So what is the reason why you vote for our side of the house? Because even in their best case scenario, where they're just passing amendments over and over again, if Bolsonaro passes a bunch of bad amendments, as Miles correctly asked their third speaker, then what? Then how do they change the amendments? Because there's no constitutional convention that is going to force you to change those. You have to rely on politicians to systematically dismantle every single one of the 100 harmful amendments that were passed. On probability, we think on our side of the house, you force people to vote in politicians that are more likely to behave well during constitutional conventions. This was the entire point of our case. Their best case scenario means that the harms are symmetrical, and their more reasonable scenario means you get benefits of having a very likely constitutional convention. This is very good offense for our side of the house. And notably, this was our worst case scenario. So what's our best case scenario? Our best case scenario is the stable democracies. What are the 3 best reasons why you don't get changed through ad hoc things like amendments? They say, if you like founding fathers, then you never change the Constitution on our side of the house. No, our whole argument is that if you normalize having regular constitutional conventions, you don't have the politicians saying, I will not come to the table because I'm going to look weak if I say to all the pro-NRA people, I'm going to now negotiate on gun control. Secondly, now you have people actually voting on the platform of changing the Constitution, because now it's normalized. This is a thing that you can do. And thirdly, we told you can never get redress for preemptive situations, because if you don't make it a big deal that Facebook is going to take over the world, it's going to be too late, and Mark Zuckerberg is going to destroy all your elections. We're American, we know this is the case. So then what's the change? We said, first of all, it's normalized for people to vote in politicians who are going to do good things during constitutional conventions. And then if they don't, the next wave of politicians is going to fix all the problems. On their side of the house, you get no way to correct bad amendments. Secondly, we told you there's stability, and I think they were extremely dismissive of this argument. What Cam meant by stability is that in the status quo, you have judges arguing about the proper constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. When you change it and make it very clear during a constitutional amendment that you didn't mean it was okay to use really bad guns when you only had rifles during the American Revolution, then it is very clear what you do on gun control. The clarifications of the modern world are where you get the stability and you get better laws, which I would note they never address on their side of the house. Very clear, you get regular conventions, and you also get the secondary option to change bad scenarios on either side of the house. They have no flexibility. It's a clear proposition ballot.
Great. I thank the speaker for their speech, and thank you to both teams for your contribution to the round, and thank you to the volunteer for timekeeping and doing all the other tech checks. We're going to leave this room. I don't know which breakout